Sometimes the loneliest people are those who've been wanted for all the wrong reasons. Everyone sees what they want to see, but nobody bothers to look deeper at what lies beneath. In the dusty frontier town of Sagebrush Bend, a towering cowboy named Jake has spent years drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to grow roots. Built strong but gentle-hearted, he's tired of being valued only for his size. Then he meets Grace, the town's schoolteacher in her late 40s, who's grown weary of empty promises from lesser men. Their friendship grows through quiet conversations and comfortable silences until Grace opens her heart. But Jake pulls away, haunted by those who only saw his body, never his soul. As secrets from their past surface and a storm gathers, both face a difficult truth. Can two people who've been hurt before find the courage to believe in something real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass bell sat on Grace Whitman's desk like a faithful sentinel, its worn surface reflecting the morning light that streamed through the schoolhouse windows. She'd inherited it from her father, a man who'd spent 40 years teaching children in a one-room schoolhouse back in Ohio. Now, it served the same purpose here in Sagebrush Bend, calling her students to attention each morning with its clear, honest tone. Grace ran her fingers along the bell's smooth edges, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. 5 years she'd been in this dusty Colorado town. 5 years since she'd fled the wreckage of her life back east. The memories still stung, standing in her wedding dress while her fiancé Charles explained that he'd found someone younger, someone who wouldn't challenge his ideas or expect too much from life. "You're too much for most men, Grace," he'd said, as if her intelligence and independence were character flaws to be managed rather than gifts to be cherished. She'd come to Sagebrush Bend because it was as far from Philadelphia as the railroad could take her, and because they desperately needed a teacher. The previous one had married a rancher and moved to Denver, leaving behind a classroom full of eager children and a community that valued education even in their remote corner of the world. The sound of hoofbeats outside drew her attention to the window. A man was dismounting from a large bay horse in front of Henderson's general store, his movements economical and sure. Even from a distance, Grace could see he was uncommonly tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and honest labor. He moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin, yet there was something careful about the way he held himself, as if he were perpetually mindful of taking up too much space. Jake Morrison had arrived in Sagebrush Bend 3 days ago, though Grace had only glimpsed him from afar. The town's gossip network, led by the indomitable Mrs. Henderson, had already delivered a full report. He was seeking work at the Mackenzie Ranch. He was polite but quiet, and he possessed what the ladies of the town described with appreciative size as classical proportions. Grace frowned at that particular piece of intelligence. In her experience, men who were praised primarily for their physical attributes often had little else to recommend them. But something in the way Jake carried himself suggested otherwise. There was a thoughtfulness to his movements, a consideration that spoke of depth beneath the impressive exterior. The morning bell ceremony completed, Grace gathered her lesson, plans, and prepared for another day of guiding young minds through the mysteries of arithmetic and literature. Her students would arrive soon, a collection of ranch children ranging from 6 to 16, all hungry for knowledge in their own particular ways. The door creaked open, and Tommy Mackenzie burst through, his freckled face bright with excitement. At 8 years old, he was Grace's most enthusiastic pupil, full of questions about everything from cloud formations to why horses needed shoes. "Miss Grace, did you see the new man who's coming to work for Grandpa Pete? He's bigger than our barn." "Da, but he helped Mrs. Chen carry her groceries yesterday, and he was real gentle about it. Didn't even make her feel small or nothing." Grace smiled at Tommy's breathless report. "That's very observant of you, Tommy. Did you finish your arithmetic homework?" "Yes, Mom. He produced a slate covered with carefully worked sums. "But I wanted to tell you. The new man, Jake, he was reading a book while he waited outside the store, a real thick one with tiny letters." This detail caught Grace's attention more than all of Mrs. Henderson's descriptions of classical proportions. A man who read for pleasure was a rarity in any frontier town, where literacy was often limited to the practical necessities of business and correspondence. The rest of her students arrived in their usual tumultuous rush, the Patterson twins, Mary and Margaret, 16 and ready to graduate, young David Chen, whose family had settled in the valley 2 years ago, and half a dozen others, each carrying their own dreams and challenges. As Grace led them through their morning recitations, she found her gaze drifting to the window. Jake had finished his business at the store and was now in conversation with old Pete Mackenzie, the ranch owner who'd become something of a father figure to the community. Pete's weathered hands gestured animatedly as he spoke, and Grace could see Jake listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. The morning lessons proceeded smoothly. Geography for the younger children, literature discussion for the older ones. Grace had just begun reading aloud from The Last of the Mohicans, when a commotion outside interrupted her. A horse had thrown its rider near the schoolhouse, and the animal was now limping badly, clearly in distress. Grace set down her book and moved to the window, her students crowding behind her. Jake appeared as if from nowhere, his long strides covering the ground quickly, but as he approached the injured horse, his movements became slow and deliberate. He spoke in low, soothing tones, his large hands gentle as he examined the animal's leg. There was something almost musical about the way he communicated with the frightened horse, a patience and understanding that transformed his imposing size into something protective rather than threatening. "Children, let's continue our reading," Grace said softly, but her attention remained fixed on the scene outside. Jake had somehow calmed the horse completely and was now carefully leading it toward the livery stable, his massive frame moving with surprising grace beside the injured animal. Young Tommy pressed his nose against the glass. "See, Miss Grace, I told you he was different. Most men that big, they try to muscle things around, but he's gentle-like, the way you are with us when we're scared or hurt." The comparison startled Grace. She prided herself on her ability to create a safe space for learning, to meet each child where they were and guide them forward with patience and understanding. To see similar qualities in a man, particularly one blessed with such obvious physical advantages, was both surprising and intriguing. Lunchtime arrived, and Grace dismissed her students for their midday break. As they scattered to their various pursuits, she found herself walking toward Henderson's store, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but truthfully hoping for another glimpse of the mysterious Jake Morrison. The store bell jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Henderson looked up from her account ledger with the bright expression of someone who lived for conversation. "Grace, dear, perfect timing. I was just telling Mr. Morrison here about our school. He's quite interested in our educational efforts." Grace turned to find Jake standing near the book section of the store, which was admittedly small but carefully curated. He held a volume of poetry in his large hands, treating it with the same gentle care she'd observed with the injured horse. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice was deep but quiet, with the kind of resonance that suggested strength held carefully in check. "Mr. Morrison," Grace replied, noting how he seemed to make even Mrs. Henderson's spacious store feel smaller simply by being in it. "I understand you helped with the injured horse this morning. That was very kind of you." "Wasn't much," Jake said, his eyes meeting hers briefly before glancing away. Horse just needed someone to listen to what it was trying to say. The simple profundity of that statement struck Grace unexpectedly. How many people, she wondered, took the time to truly listen, whether to horses, children, or other human beings struggling to communicate their needs? "Are you interested in poetry, Mr. Morrison?" she asked, gesturing to the book in his hands. A slight flush colored his cheeks. I find it helps pass the evening hours. Words put together just right. They can say things that regular talking can't. Manage, Mrs. Henderson beamed with approval. A man who appreciates the finer things. Grace here is our teacher, and she has quite the collection of books herself. Perhaps you two could discuss literature sometime. Grace felt her own cheeks warm at Mrs. Henderson's less than subtle matchmaking, but Jake's response surprised her. I'd be honored, ma'am, if Miss Whitman wouldn't mind the company of someone who's better with horses than conversation. There was no false modesty in his statement, simply an honest assessment delivered without self-pity. Grace found herself curious about this quiet giant who spoke to injured animals and found solace in poetry. I think good conversation can happen anywhere, Mr. Morrison. Books are just another way of talking to someone across time and distance. Jake's face lit up with understanding. Like having a friend you've never met. Exactly like that. Mrs. Henderson practically vibrated with satisfaction at this exchange. Well, isn't this lovely? Two literary souls finding common ground right here in my store. Grace purchased her supplies, paper, ink, and a few other classroom necessities, while Jake selected the poetry book he'd been examining. As they prepared to leave, he held the door for her with old-fashioned courtesy. Thank you, Grace said, stepping into the afternoon sunshine. Miss Whitman, Jake said, his voice carrying a note of hesitation. If you wouldn't think it too forward, I'll be working at the Mackenzie place, and sometimes the children come by to see the horses. If you ever wanted to bring your class for a visit, show them how a working ranch operates, you'd be welcome. Grace considered the offer. Her students would indeed benefit from seeing the practical applications of their arithmetic lessons in ranch management, and Tommy's obvious fascination with Jake suggested the man would be patient with curious children. That's very generous. Mr. Morrison, I think my students would enjoy that very much. As Jake mounted his horse and rode toward the Mackenzie ranch, Grace watched his retreating figure with a mixture of curiosity and caution. There had been something in his eyes, a wariness that spoke of old hurts, combined with a loneliness that called to her own carefully guarded heart. But Grace Whitman had learned hard lessons about the difference between what men appeared to be and what they truly were. She would proceed carefully, if at all. Yet as she walked back toward the schoolhouse, she found herself looking forward to that ranch visit with her students, and to discovering whether Jake Morrison's depth matched his obvious kindness. The brass bell on her desk caught the afternoon light as she entered the empty classroom, and Grace ran her fingers along its familiar surface. Her father had always said that teaching meant learning to see potential in everyone, even the ones who seemed most unlikely to surprise you. Perhaps it was time to apply that lesson to her own life, one careful conversation at a time. The school visit to the Mackenzie Ranch came 2 weeks later, on a crisp October morning when the aspen trees painted the mountainsides in shades of gold and amber. Grace led her small procession of students down the dusty road, their excited chatter creating a cheerful counterpoint to the steady clip-clop of their borrowed wagon horse. Tommy Mackenzie had been beside himself with anticipation, having appointed himself unofficial tour guide, despite Grace's gentle reminders that they were guests on his grandfather's property. The other children shared his enthusiasm, though the older ones tried to maintain an air of sophisticated indifference that fooled no one. The Mackenzie Ranch sprawled across a valley floor bordered by towering pines and red rock formations. Neat fences divided pastures where cattle grazed contentedly, and the main house sat like a comfortable dowager, surrounded by barns, corrals, and various outbuildings that spoke of prosperous, well-managed enterprise. Old Pete Mackenzie met them at the main gate, his weathered face creased with genuine pleasure. "Welcome, welcome. Jake's got the horses ready for you to meet, and I thought we'd show you how we figure feed costs and breeding records, make those arithmetic lessons come alive." Grace smiled at his enthusiasm. Pete had been one of her earliest supporters when she'd arrived in Sagebrush Bend, understanding instinctively that education was an investment in the community's future. They found Jake in the main corral, working with a young horse that danced nervously at the end of a long rope. His movements were patient and rhythmic, and Grace could hear him speaking in the same low, soothing tones she'd observed during the incident with the injured horse. "Children, let's watch quietly," Grace instructed, recognizing something special in the scene before them. "Mr. Morrison is teaching this horse to trust." Jake became aware of his audience gradually, his concentration never wavering from the animal in his care. The horse, a beautiful chestnut mare with intelligent eyes, had clearly been mistreated. At some point, she flinched away from sudden movements and kept her ears pinned back in defensive wariness. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, his voice carrying across the corral like a prayer. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. Just learning to dance together, that's all we're doing." Young David Chen raised his hand. "Miss Grace, why is the horse so scared?" Jake heard the question and glanced toward Grace, asking silent permission before addressing the children directly. She nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes," Jake said, never taking his attention completely off the mare, "horses get hurt by people who don't understand that being strong doesn't mean you have to be rough. This lady here, she's learning that not all humans are the same." Mary Patterson, the older of the twins, studied the interaction with 16-year-old wisdom. "How do you show her that you're different?" Jake's face softened with appreciation for the question's depth. "Same way you'd want someone to show you, I reckon. Patience, consistency, keeping your word. If I say I won't hurt her, then I never hurt her. Not even a little bit. Eventually she'll decide for herself whether to trust me or not." Grace found herself transfixed by more than just the horse training demonstration. There was something profound in Jake's approach, a philosophy that extended far beyond working with animals. The way he spoke about earning trust, about proving himself through consistent action rather than grand gestures, resonated with her own hard-won understanding of human nature. The mare took a tentative step closer to Jake, her ears flicking forward. For the first time, a collective held breath from the watching children accompanied this small miracle. "She's deciding," Jake said quietly, extending his hand palm up, allowing the horse to investigate his scent. "Can't force it. Trust has to be offered freely, or it's not really trust at all." The mare stretched her neck toward Jake's outstretched hand, her nostrils flaring as she took his measure. After a moment that felt suspended in time, she allowed him to touch her muzzle gently. Tommy Mackenzie let out a whoop of delight, and even the older children applauded spontaneously. Jake's face showed quiet satisfaction, but Grace noticed how he immediately redirected attention to the horse. "She's the brave one here," he said, stroking the mare's neck with infinite gentleness. "Takes courage to trust again after someone's broken it." The words seemed to hang in the air, carrying meanings that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with the human heart. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that perhaps she and this quiet man shared similar scars. The rest of the visit proceeded with educational tours of the ranch facilities, demonstrations of cattle management, and Pete's enthusiastic explanations of ranch economics. But Grace found her attention repeatedly drawn back to Jake, observing the way he interacted with her students. He treated each child with the same careful respect he'd shown the frightened mare, never talking down to them, but explaining concepts in ways they could understand. When Tommy asked if he could pet the mare, Jake spent several minutes teaching the boy proper approach techniques, emphasizing the importance of moving slowly and letting the horse make the first contact. "Animals know if you mean them well," Jake explained, guiding Tommy's small hand in the correct petting motion. "Same as people, really. They can sense if you're trying to take something from them or if you're offering something good." It was then that Tommy produced his drawing, a piece of paper he'd been working on during quiet moments at school. The sketch showed Jake kneeling beside the injured horse from that day 2 weeks ago, his large frame somehow conveying both strength and tenderness in Tommy's childish but perceptive artwork. Jake accepted the drawing with obvious surprise, studying it with the same careful attention he'd given the nervous mare. "This is real fine work, Tommy. You caught something here that most folks miss." "What's that, Mr. Jake?" "That helping someone doesn't have to look like what people expect it to look like." Grace felt her breath catch at the simple profundity of the observation. As they prepared to return to town, she approached Jake to thank him for the educational experience he'd provided her students. "They learned more about patience and kindness today than I could teach them in a month of regular lessons," she said, genuinely moved by what she'd witnessed. Jake shifted uncomfortably under her praise, his eyes moving past her to the mountains beyond. "Just doing what comes natural, Mom. Animals and children, they deserve honesty. And adults?" Grace found herself asking, though she hadn't planned the question. For a moment, Jake's gaze met hers directly, and she saw something vulnerable there, quickly shuttered. "Adults are more complicated. They've got reasons for not trusting, and usually they're good reasons." The statement felt like both confession and warning, and Grace recognized the careful distance he was trying to maintain, even as something deeper passed between them. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the best reasons for not trusting become the best reasons for being careful about who you do trust." Jake studied her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. "Miss Whitman, He stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that wouldn't come. "I appreciate your bringing the children by. They're lucky to have a teacher who understands that learning happens everywhere, not just in books." As they loaded the children back into the wagon for the return trip to town, Grace tucked Tommy's drawing carefully into her teaching satchel. Something about the image, Jake's gentle strength captured in a child's honest perception, seemed too precious to leave behind. The ride back to Sagebrush Bend was filled with excited chatter from her students, but Grace found herself thinking about the moment when the mare had finally chosen to trust Jake's outstretched hand. There had been something achingly beautiful about that instant of connection, that leap of faith across the gulf of past hurt. She wondered what it would feel like to be that brave, to risk extending her own trust towards someone whose careful kindness seemed to promise safety, but whose wariness suggested his own collection of wounds. The possibility both thrilled and terrified her, like standing at the edge of a cliff with no way of knowing whether the ground below would prove solid or give way entirely. That evening, as Grace prepared her lessons for the following day, Tommy's drawing lay open on her desk beside her father's brass bell. Two symbols of different kinds of nurturing, one celebrating the strength that protects and heals, the other representing the patient work of helping others grow. For the first time in 5 years, Grace found herself wondering if those two kinds of strength might somehow belong in the same life. In the days following the ranch visit, Jake found himself riding past the schoolhouse with increasing frequency, always with what seemed like perfectly legitimate reasons. He needed supplies from Henderson's store. He was checking on fence repairs. For Pete, he was delivering messages to various townspeople on ranch business. Grace noticed, of course. It was impossible not to observe the way his large frame on horseback had become a regular part of the landscape visible from her classroom window. What surprised her was how much she'd begun to look forward to these glimpses, and how disappointed she felt on the days when he didn't appear. The realization troubled her more than she cared to admit. She'd promised herself after Charles that she wouldn't allow another man to become so central to her emotional well-being. Yet here she was, 37 years old and supposedly wise to the ways of the world, organizing her day around the possible appearance of a man she barely knew. It was Mrs. Henderson who finally engineered their next substantial conversation, with all the subtle manipulation of a seasoned matchmaker disguised as casual coincidence. "Grace, dear," she announced one Thursday afternoon as Grace selected thread for a mending project, "would you mind terribly helping me with something? That nice Mr. Morrison has expressed interest in expanding his reading materials, and I thought perhaps you could recommend some titles. He's quite particular about quality, and you have such refined taste." Grace glanced toward the store's modest book section, where Jake stood examining a volume with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I'm sure Mr. Morrison is perfectly capable of selecting his own reading material, Mrs. Henderson." "Oh, but he specifically asked for guidance from someone who understands literature," Mrs. Henderson continued with impressive persistence. "Said he'd rather have one good recommendation than make a poor choice on his own." Whether this was true, or simply Mrs. Henderson's creative interpretation of events, Grace found herself approaching Jake with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He looked up as she drew near, and she noticed the book in his hands was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson. "Challenging choice," Grace observed, genuinely impressed by his selection. Jake's expression showed mild embarrassment. "Maybe. Too challenging. I've read some of his shorter pieces, but this seems like it might be beyond my schooling." Grace studied his face, noting the intelligence that belied his self-deprecating words. "What did you think of the shorter pieces?" "Made me think about things differently, about self-reliance, about trusting your own judgment even when others disagree." Jake paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Sometimes I wonder if I rely too much on what other people think of me." The admission was quietly profound, and Grace felt something tighten in her chest. "That's a very human struggle, Mr. Morrison. Even Emerson himself wrestled with it. You think I should attempt this, then?" Grace considered the question seriously. "I think anyone who recognizes the value in challenging themselves intellectually is already equipped to handle the challenge. Besides," she added with a small smile, "if you find passages that puzzle you, I'd be happy to discuss them. Sometimes talking through difficult ideas helps clarify them." Jake's eyes met hers directly for the first time since their conversation. "Began. You do that? Even knowing I might need a considerable amount of guidance?" "Mr. Morrison," Grace said gently, "teaching is what I do. The subject matter matters less than the genuine desire to learn." As Jake purchased his book and prepared to leave, he turned back toward Grace with what appeared to be carefully gathered courage. "Miss Whitman, would you consider taking a walk Sunday after church services? There's a spot by the creek where the aspens are particularly beautiful this time of year. I thought, if you wouldn't find it improper, we could discuss that Emerson book or whatever else might interest you." Grace felt her pulse quicken unexpectedly. A walk with Jake Morrison would certainly generate talk among the townspeople, and she'd worked hard to establish herself as a respectable, independent woman. But something in his careful formality, the way he'd framed the invitation around intellectual discussion rather than romantic pursuit, made the offer feel safe somehow. "I think that would be very pleasant, Mr. Morrison." The smile that transformed Jake's face was worth whatever gossip might follow. Sunday arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made everything seem sharper and more beautiful. Grace chose her second-best dress, practical enough for walking, but nice enough to show she'd made an effort, and met Jake outside the church after services concluded. The walk to the creek took them along a well-worn path that wound through stands of golden aspen trees. Jake had been right about the beauty of the location. The trees formed a natural cathedral overhead, their leaves whispering secrets in the gentle breeze. They walked in comfortable silence at first. Jake's longer stride adjusted considerately. To match Grace's pace, she found herself stealing glances at his profile, noting the way he seemed to take genuine pleasure in their natural surroundings. "Do you miss it?" Grace asked eventually. "The traveling, the different places you've seen?" Jake considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "Parts of it. There's something to be said for new horizons, fresh starts. But there's something to be said for staying in one place long enough to understand it properly too. And which appeals to you more now?" "Now?" Jake stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Now I'm starting to think the best things in life require time and patience to develop properly." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication of his words. They resumed walking, and she found herself crafting a careful response. Time and patience can be luxuries that not everyone feels they can afford, she said finally. Sometimes, circumstances force us to make quick decisions to protect ourselves from potential hurt. Jake was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if she'd said too much, revealed more vulnerability than wisdom dictated. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience. "I've known women," he said carefully, "who made it clear they were interested in what I could provide rather than who I was. Strong back for heavy work, impressive appearance for social functions, that sort of thing. After a while, you start to wonder if that's all you're good for." Grace stopped walking entirely, surprised by his honesty. That must have been very lonely. It was. Jake met her eyes directly. But loneliness is better than being valued for the wrong reasons. At least when you're alone, you're not pretending to be something you're not. The conversation had taken an unexpectedly intimate turn, and Grace felt the need to reciprocate his vulnerability with her own truth. "My fiancé left me for someone younger," she said quietly, "but before he left, he spent months trying to change fundamental things about my personality. Said I was too opinionated, too independent, that I made him look weak in front of his business associates." Jake's expression darkened with something that might have been anger, though not directed at her. "Then he was a fool who didn't deserve you." The simple declaration, delivered with quiet conviction, caught Grace off guard. She'd expected platitudes or awkward sympathy, not this straightforward defense of her worth. "Thank you," she said, surprised by how much his words meant to her. They reached the creek, where a fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking the water. As they settled beside each other, Grace pulled out the bookmark she'd been working on, a piece of soft leather tooled with pressed wildflowers and fitted with a braided cord. "I made this for you," she said, offering the bookmark with sudden shyness. "For the Emerson book, the flowers are from the schoolhouse garden." Jake accepted the gift with obvious surprise and genuine pleasure, examining the delicate craftsmanship with the same careful attention he gave everything else. "This is beautiful work, Miss Whitman. No one's ever made something like this for me before." "It's just a practical thing," Grace said, deflecting his thanks even as she felt pleased by his reaction. "I thought you might find it useful." Jake looked up from the bookmark to study her face. "It's not just practical, and we both know it. This took time and thought and caring. That makes it precious." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and careful hope. Grace found herself wondering what it would feel like to close the remaining distance between them, to discover whether his gentleness extended to more intimate forms of caring. But Jake seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts, and she watched as he deliberately created more space between them on the log, his expression becoming guarded. "Once again, we should head back," he said quietly. "People will talk if we're gone too long." The walk back to town was subdued, both of them seeming to recognize that something significant had shifted between them, though neither was quite ready to name what that something might be. The annual barn raising for the Murphy family brought the entire community of Sagebrush Bend together on a crisp Saturday morning in late October. The Murphys had lost their barn to a lightning strike the previous month, and frontier tradition demanded that neighbors rally to help rebuild what nature had destroyed. Grace arrived early with baskets of food prepared by the church ladies, but her eyes immediately sought Jake among the assembled men. She found him organizing lumber with old Pete, his sleeves already rolled up despite the morning chill. There was something deeply satisfying about watching him work, the economical movements, the way other men naturally deferred to his judgment about structural matters, the quiet confidence that never slipped into arrogance. "Grace, dear, you're staring," Mrs. Henderson observed with barely concealed amusement as she unpacked her own contributions to the communal meal. "I was observing the organizational process," Grace replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "It's quite impressive how efficiently the men coordinate these efforts." Mrs. Henderson's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled by this explanation, but she had the grace not to press the point. As the morning progressed, Grace found herself assigned to various tasks that somehow kept placing her in Jake's vicinity. Whether this was coincidence or the machinations of well-meaning matchmakers, she couldn't say, but she wasn't entirely displeased by the arrangement. The first real interaction came when Jake approached the food tables during the midday break, his shirt damp with honest sweat and sawdust clinging to his dark hair. Grace was replenishing the water buckets when he appeared beside her, close enough that she could smell the scent of pine wood and hard work. "Miss Whitman," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you again for that bookmark. I've been reading the Emerson essays, and having a proper place to mark my progress makes the whole endeavor feel more serious somehow." Grace felt an unexpected surge of pleasure at his words. "Have you found any passages particularly meaningful?" Jake's expression grew thoughtful. "There's one about trusting yourself even when the whole world seems to be against your judgment. Got me thinking about choices I've made and choices I've been too afraid to make." The conversation was interrupted by young David Chen, who came running up with obvious distress written across his features. "Miss Grace! Mr. Jake! There's something wrong with Mary Patterson. She's crying and won't say why, and Margaret's real upset too." Grace immediately abandoned the water buckets and followed David toward the shade of a large cottonwood, where she found Mary sitting on the ground, her face streaked with tears. Margaret knelt beside her sister, looking helplessly angry. "Mary, honey, what's happened?" Grace asked, settling beside the distraught girl with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to adolescent crises. "It's nothing, Miss Grace," Mary said, though her trembling voice suggested otherwise. "Just some of the older boys being stupid." Margaret's jaw tightened with protective fury. "They said things, horrible things about Mary's figure, about how she's developed more than other girls her age, made suggestions about what that means." Grace felt her own anger rising, but she forced her voice to remain calm and supportive. "Mary, I'm so sorry that happened. Some people say cruel things when they're trying to make themselves feel important." Jake had followed them to the tree, and Grace could see him taking in the situation with careful attention. When Mary looked up and saw his imposing presence, she seemed to shrink further into herself. "It's all right, Mr. Jake," she said quickly. "I know I'm probably just being silly." Jake's expression grew incredibly gentle as he settled his large frame onto the ground nearby, careful not to loom over the upset teenager. "Mary," he said quietly, "can I tell you something that might help?" The girl nodded hesitantly. "When I was about 14, I grew 6 inches in 1 year. Went from being normal-sized to being the tallest person in 3 counties practically overnight. People started treating me different. Some afraid, some making assumptions about what I could do or should do based purely on how I looked. Made me feel like I wasn't a real person anymore, just a collection of other people's expectations." Mary's tears had stopped, and she was listening with the focused attention that Jake's quiet wisdom seemed to inspire in everyone from horses to teenagers. "What did you do?" she asked softly. "Took me years to figure out that what other people think about your appearance says more about them than it does about you. The folks worth knowing will see past the surface to who you really are. The others, well, their opinions don't count for much in the long run." Jake reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden whistle carved with intricate patterns that spoke of hours of patient work. He offered it to Mary with the same gentle ceremony he might use with a skittish horse. "My grandfather made this for me when I was struggling with those growing pains. Said it was for calling help when I needed it, but really it was just his way of reminding me that I was worthy of care and protection. I'd like you to have it." Mary accepted the whistle with wonder, turning it over in her hands to examine the careful craftsmanship. "But this is yours. It must be important to you." "It is important," Jake agreed. "That's why I want you to have it. Important things should go to people who deserve them." Grace felt something shift profoundly in her chest as she watched this interaction. The casual cruelty of teenage boys was unfortunately common, But Jake's response, the way he'd transformed his own painful experiences into comfort for someone else, revealed a depth of character that took her breath away. As the afternoon wore on and the barn took shape under the collective effort of the community, Grace found herself working alongside Jake with increasing frequency. Whether they were sorting nails, carrying water to the workers, or helping coordinate the meal service, they fell into an easy partnership that felt both natural and significant. "You were wonderful with Mary earlier," Grace told him during a quiet moment as they watched the barn's frame rising against the sky. Not many men would understand what she was going through or know how to help. Jake's expression grew distant. "Had a sister once, back in Kansas. She went through something similar. Wish I'd known then what to say to help her." The past tense caught Grace's attention, but something in Jake's tone suggested this wasn't a topic he was ready to explore further. Instead, she simply said, "I think you learned exactly what needed to be learned. Mary will treasure that whistle, not just for itself, but for the kindness behind it." As the sun began to set and the barn stood complete, the community gathered for a celebration dinner. Grace found herself seated across from Jake at one of the long tables, close enough to observe the way he listened to conversations without dominating them, the way he made sure elderly Mrs. Chen got the best pieces of chicken, the way he answered Tommy Mackenzie's endless questions with patient good humor. When the evening finally drew to a close and neighbors began dispersing to their homes, Jake approached Grace as she gathered the empty food baskets. "Miss Whitman, would you allow me to walk you home? It's getting dark, and I'd feel better knowing you arrived safely." The offer was perfectly proper and considerate, but something in Jake's tone suggested it meant more to him than simple courtesy. Grace found herself nodding acceptance before she'd fully considered the implications. The walk to her small house took them through the quiet streets of Sagebrush Bend, past windows glowing with lamplight and the comfortable sounds of families settling in for the night. They moved in companionable silence, both seemingly reluctant to break the spell of the day's shared experiences. At her front gate, Jake paused, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Grace," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Today felt different somehow, working alongside you, seeing how you cared for Mary, watching you bring people together. It made me think about things I haven't let myself think about in a long time." Grace's heart quickened at his words, but she also sensed his struggle with whatever he was trying to communicate. "Jake," she said gently, matching his use of first names, "whatever you're thinking, you don't have to figure it all out tonight. Some things are worth taking time to understand properly." The gratitude in his expression told her she'd said the right thing. But as he bid her good night and walked away into the darkness, Grace wondered if her own heart would be patient enough to wait for him to find his courage. November brought the first serious cold snap to Sagebrush Bend, and with it a shift in the delicate dance that Jake and Grace had been performing around their growing feelings. Their Sunday walks had become a cherished routine, always properly, chaperoned by the presence of other townspeople, enjoying the same paths, always focused on safe topics like literature and teaching and the changing seasons. But beneath the careful propriety, something deeper was building, a current of understanding and longing that neither seemed quite ready to acknowledge directly. It was during one of these walks, as they paused to watch ice crystals forming along the creek's edge, that Grace, finally, found the courage to speak the truth that had been weighing on her heart. "Jake," she said, her breath visible in small clouds in the cold air, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll hear me out completely before you respond." Jake's expression grew cautious, but he nodded for her to continue. "These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your kindness with the children and your wisdom with troubled souls like Mary, it's made me realize that I care for you deeply. More than friendship, more than intellectual companionship." Grace paused, gathering her courage for the most difficult part. "I believe I'm falling in love with you, Jake Morrison, and I needed you to know that before I lost my nerve entirely." The words hung between them in the crisp air, And Grace watched Jake's face cycle through surprise, pleasure, and then something that looked terrifyingly like panic. "Grace," he said softly, "you don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," she replied firmly. "I'm 37 years old, Jake. I've been engaged before, I've felt attraction before, and I've experienced infatuation. This is different. This is real." Jake turned away from her, staring out at the frozen creek as if the ice formations might provide answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "You think you care for me now," he said finally, "but what happens when the newness wears off? When you realize that underneath all the pretty words about gentleness and wisdom, I'm just a big man with a strong back and limited prospects? What happens when you start wishing I was more refined, more educated, more worthy of a woman like you?" The pain in his voice broke Grace's heart, but also kindled her anger, not at him, but at whoever had taught him to think so little of his own worth. "Jake Morrison," she said, stepping around to face him directly. "Look at me." Reluctantly, he met her eyes. "I have spent weeks watching you read philosophy and discuss it with genuine insight. I've seen you comfort a frightened child and gentle a traumatized horse with equal skill. I've watched you organize barn raisings and defer to others' expertise, and listen more than you speak because you understand that wisdom often comes disguised as quiet observation." Grace's voice grew stronger with each word. "If you think those qualities are somehow less valuable than social position or formal education, then you understand neither me nor yourself very well." Jake's expression showed he wanted to believe her, but doubt still shadowed his features. "Grace, you're an educated woman from a good family. You could have any man in this territory who has something real to offer. Why would you settle for someone like me?" The word "settle" hit Grace like a physical blow. She stepped back, suddenly understanding that this conversation required more than reassurance. It required complete honesty about the depth of her feelings. "Because," she said quietly, "in all my 37 years, I have never met a man who made me feel both completely safe and entirely alive at the same time. Because when you look at me, I feel seen in a way that has nothing to do with what I can provide or how I might reflect on your reputation. Because you're the first man who's ever made me believe that love might actually exist. Not the negotiated partnership I had with Charles, but real love based on genuine respect and understanding." Jake's control seemed to crack slightly at her words, and Grace saw longing war with fear in his expression. "And what if I disappoint you?" he asked. "What if I'm not the man you think I am? What if you are exactly the man I think you are and you're too afraid to believe it?" Grace countered gently. For a moment it seemed as though Jake might step closer, might take the leap of faith that Grace was offering, but then his expression shuttered again, and she watched him retreat behind the careful walls he'd constructed around his heart. "I need time to think," he said finally. "This is too important to get wrong." Grace felt disappointment settle in her chest like a cold stone, but she forced herself to nod, understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need." The walk back to town was subdued, both of them lost in their own thoughts. At her gate, Jake paused, as if he wanted to say something more, but in the end, he simply touched his hat brim in farewell and disappeared into the gathering dusk. The next few days passed in a blur of awkward encounters and careful avoidance. Jake stopped making his regular trips past the schoolhouse, and when they encountered each other at Henderson's store or after church services, their conversations remained painfully polite and distant. Grace threw herself into her teaching with renewed vigor, but her students, particularly the perceptive Tommy Mackenzie, seemed to sense her distress. "Miss Grace," Tommy said after class one afternoon, "are you and Mr. Jake having an argument? He seems real sad lately, and you've been different too." Grace managed to smile for the boy's concern. "Sometimes adults need to figure out complicated things, Tommy. It doesn't mean anyone's done anything wrong." "But you like each other," Tommy said with 8-year-old logic. "I can tell. So why don't you just be happy together?" If only it were that simple, Grace thought. But she simply told Tommy that grown-up feelings were more complex than they sometimes appeared, and sent him home with extra arithmetic problems to occupy his curious mind. It was Mrs. Henderson who finally forced the issue, cornering Grace in the store on a Thursday afternoon with the determined expression of a woman who'd run out of patience with other people's romantic foolishness. "Grace Whitman," she announced, "I don't know what's happened between you and that poor Morrison boy, but it needs to be fixed. He's been moping around like a lost soul, and you look like you haven't slept properly in a week." "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your concern, but—" "No buts," the older woman interrupted. "That man is head over heels in love with you. Any fool can see it, and you're just as gone on him. So whatever's keeping you apart, it's not worth the misery you're both putting yourselves through." Grace felt tears threaten for the first time since that conversation by the creek. "It's not that simple. Jake doesn't believe that my feelings are genuine. He thinks I'll eventually realize he's not good enough for me." Mrs. Henderson snorted with derision. "Men can be the most foolish creatures God ever created, too proud to accept a blessing when it's handed to them on a silver platter." That evening, as Grace sat alone in her small parlor grading papers by lamplight, she found herself staring at the bundle of letters she kept in her writing desk. Correspondence from Charles during their engagement, filled with subtle criticisms disguised as loving guidance. On impulse, she gathered the letters and walked to her fireplace. One by one, she fed them to the flames, watching years of self-doubt and diminished expectations curl into ash. If Jake Morrison couldn't see her worth, that was his loss. But she wouldn't allow his fears to convince her that her love wasn't valuable enough to offer to someone brave enough to accept it. The letters burned with surprising brightness, filling her parlor with warmth and the promise of new beginnings. Grace watched until the last ember died, then returned to her papers with a lighter heart and a renewed sense of her own value. She would give Jake the space he'd requested, but she wouldn't apologize for loving him. Some gifts, once offered, couldn't be taken back, and she was beginning to think that might be exactly as it should be. The winter deepened around Sagebrush Bend, and with it came an unexpected routine that neither Grace nor Jake had planned, but both seemed powerless to resist. Every Sunday evening, after the awkwardness of polite exchanges following church services, Jake would appear at Grace's front gate with his mother's worn Bible tucked under his arm. "Miss Whitman," he would say with careful formality, "if you're not otherwise occupied, I wondered if you might be willing to discuss the sermon. Reverend Thompson's interpretations sometimes leave me with questions." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. Reverend Thompson's sermons were straightforward enough for any reasonably intelligent person to understand without scholarly discussion. But Grace found herself accepting these visits because they provided the only opportunity to spend time with Jake without the weight of her declaration hanging explicitly between them. Their conversations during these evenings revealed depths to Jake that Grace found increasingly compelling. His theological questions were thoughtful and genuine, shaped by a man who'd seen enough of life's hardships to wrestle seriously with questions of faith and justice. He spoke of losing his parents young, of watching good people suffer while selfish ones prospered, of trying to reconcile belief in divine goodness with the reality of human cruelty. "Sometimes I wonder," Jake said one snowy evening in December, settling into the chair across from Grace's parlor fireplace, "if faith is supposed to make everything make sense, or if it's supposed to help us live with the things that don't make sense." Grace considered the question while she poured coffee from the pot she'd begun preparing automatically for these visits. "What do you think?" "I think maybe it's the second thing," Jake said slowly, "because trying to explain away suffering just makes you sound like you've never really suffered, but finding meaning in it, finding ways to help others through it, that seems more honest somehow." It was observations like this that made Grace's heart ache with longing. This was the Jake Morrison she'd fallen in love with, the thoughtful man who found profound truths in simple experiences, who approached life's biggest questions with humility and genuine curiosity. But even as their intellectual intimacy deepened, during these Sunday evening conversations, Jake maintained careful physical and emotional distance. He sat across the room rather than beside her on the settee. He avoided any mention of personal feelings or future plans. He addressed her as Miss Whitman with stubborn formality, as if using her first name might somehow compromise his resolve to keep their relationship safely contained. Grace respected his boundaries, but she couldn't entirely hide her growing frustration with the situation. They were behaving like polite strangers who happened to be extraordinarily compatible, and the pretense was wearing thin. The breaking point came in mid-December when Sagebrush Bend welcomed an unexpected visitor. Reverend Marcus Holloway arrived on the afternoon stage, a traveling minister with credentials from the seminary in Denver, and what Mrs. Henderson described as distinguished silver at his temples and a way with words that could charm birds from trees. Reverend Holloway had come to conduct a wedding for distant relatives of the Chens, but his visit extended when the bride fell ill with influenza. While waiting for her recovery, he took an active interest in the community's spiritual life, offering to assist Reverend Thompson with services and visiting prominent families to discuss matters of faith and culture. It was inevitable that he would call upon Grace, the town's educated spinster schoolteacher. What surprised everyone, including Grace herself, was the obvious interest he showed in her as a woman rather than simply as a professional colleague. "Miss Whitman," Reverend Holloway said during his first visit to her parlor, "I must say it's refreshing to find someone in such a remote location who can discuss literature and theology with genuine sophistication. You're quite remarkable." Grace accepted the compliment graciously, but she couldn't help noticing the contrast between Reverend Holloway's polished approach and Jake's careful sincerity. Where Jake asked genuine questions and listened to her answers, Reverend Holloway seemed more interested in showcasing his own erudition while complimenting hers. Still, she had to admit there was something flattering about being courted by someone who clearly considered her worthy of attention. After weeks of Jake's careful distance, Reverend Holloway's obvious admiration was balm to her wounded pride. When Jake learned of Reverend Holloway's interest, and in a town the size of Sagebrush Bend, everyone learned everything within hours, his reaction was immediate and telling. "Miss Whitman," he said during their next Sunday evening Bible discussion, his voice carefully controlled, "I understand you have another caller these days." Grace set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Reverend Holloway has been very kind. He's an interesting conversationalist." "I'm sure he is," Jake said, though his tone suggested something quite different from approval. "A man of his education and position. He could offer you things that a ranch hand never could." Grace studied Jake's face, noting the tight line of his jaw and the way his hands gripped the Bible with unnecessary force. "What kinds of things, Jake?" "Respectability, social position, a place in cultured society where your intelligence would be properly appreciated. And you think those things matter to me." Jake's eyes met hers directly for the first time in weeks. "Don't they?" Grace felt a surge of anger at his willful misunderstanding of her character. "If they mattered to me, don't you think I would have stayed in Philadelphia and married Charles? Don't you think I would have chosen comfort and convention over coming to a frontier town to teach ranchers' children?" "That was different," Jake said stubbornly. "Charles hurt you. You came here to heal, not to settle permanently." "I came here to build a new life," Grace corrected firmly, "and I've succeeded. This is my home, these children are my purpose, and this community has become my family. The question isn't whether Reverend Holloway could offer me a different life, it's whether anyone could convince me to want one." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but somehow sadder. "He's a good man, Grace. Educated, well-established, respected. He could give you the kind of life you deserve." Grace felt something break inside her chest at his use of her first name, combined with what sounded suspiciously like a blessing for another man's suit. "And what kind of life do I deserve, Jake?" she asked quietly. "Better than what I could offer," he said simply. "According to whom?" Jake's expression showed surprise at the question. "According to anyone with eyes and sense. You're a lady, Grace, refined, intelligent, cultured. You deserve someone who can match those qualities, not someone who what?" Grace interrupted. "Not someone who reads philosophy for pleasure and discusses it with genuine insight? Not someone who treats children and animals with equal gentleness? Not someone who thinks deeply about faith and suffering and meaning? Not someone who works with his hands for daily wages and has no family name worth mentioning and can barely hold his own in polite conversation?" Jake finished quietly. Grace stared at him for a moment, finally understanding the full scope of his self-deception. "Jake Morrison," she said softly, "if that's truly how you see yourself, then Reverend Holloway probably is the better choice. Not because he's more worthy than you are, but because he has enough confidence in his own worth to believe he deserves to be loved." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Grace watched Jake struggle with their implications. Finally, he set down the Bible and stood to leave. "I should go," he said. "It's getting late, and you probably have preparations to make for Reverend Holloway's next visit." As Jake reached the door, Grace made one last attempt to reach him. "Jake," she called softly, "what if you're wrong? What if the life you could offer is exactly the life I want?" He paused with his hand on the doorknob, but he didn't turn around. "Then you'd be settling for less than you deserve," he said. "And I care about you too much to let that happen." The door closed behind him with quiet finality, leaving Grace alone with the dying fire and the growing certainty that Jake's noble self-sacrifice might cost them both the happiness they were too afraid to claim. The discovery came quite by accident, as many of life's most significant revelations do. Grace was helping to repair storm damage at the schoolhouse. A loose shutter had been banging against the building during the previous night's windstorm, when she climbed into the small storage loft above the main classroom to assess potential roof damage. The loft was cramped and dusty, filled with old supplies and forgotten materials from previous teachers. As Grace maneuvered around boxes and discarded furniture, her foot caught on something that sent a cascade of papers fluttering to the floor below. Cursing her clumsiness, she climbed down to gather the scattered documents. Most were old lesson plans and administrative correspondence, but one item made her freeze in recognition. It was a photograph, slightly faded but still clear, showing Jake kneeling beside a group of her students in the schoolyard. She remembered the day. It had been shortly after the ranch visit, when Jake had stopped by to repair a broken fence post that bordered the school property. But what made Grace's breath catch was not the photograph itself, but where she'd found it. The picture had been carefully placed between the pages of a book, her personal copy of Leaves of Grass, that she kept in the loft for quiet moments of reading. Someone had not only taken this photograph, but had deliberately hidden it in a place that was deeply personal to her. Grace sank into her desk chair, studying the image with new eyes. Jake's expression showed complete absorption in whatever Tommy Mackenzie was showing him. Probably another of the boy's endless collection of interesting rocks or insects. But there was something in Jake's face, a gentleness and genuine interest, that spoke of a man who found real joy in children's curiosities. More importantly, there was something in her own face in the background of the photograph. Grace could see herself watching Jake from the schoolhouse doorway, and her expression was unmistakable, the look of a woman already falling in love, even if she hadn't admitted it to herself yet. The photograph had been taken by David Chen, whose father had recently acquired a camera for documenting family occasions. But how had it ended up hidden in her private book? And who had placed it there? Grace climbed back into the loft with renewed purpose, examining the area where the photograph had been stored. Behind the box of old papers, she found something. else that made her heart race, a small leather journal, clearly handmade, filled with Jake's careful handwriting. She shouldn't read it. She knew that. A private journal was sacred territory, and discovering it by accident didn't give her the right to invade Jake's most personal thoughts. But the first page was open, and the date caught her attention. It was from Jake's second week in Sagebrush Bend, nearly 3 months ago. "The schoolteacher has the most remarkable way with her students," the entry began. "Watched her today, settling a dispute between the Chen boy and one of the Patterson twins. Could have been a real fracas, but she managed to turn it into a lesson about fairness and understanding different perspectives. Takes skill to do that, and wisdom. Don't think I've ever met a woman who carries herself with such quiet strength." Grace's hands trembled as she realized what she was holding. This wasn't just a journal, it was a record of Jake's observations about her, dating back almost to the moment they'd first encountered each other. She knew she should close the book and return it to its hiding place, but the pull of understanding Jake's true feelings was stronger than her respect for his privacy. She turned the page. "She defended me today when Mrs. Patterson made some comment about drifters who don't settle down. Didn't have to do that, barely knows me, and getting involved might have reflected poorly on her position. But she spoke up anyway. Said something about judging people by their actions rather than their circumstances. Made me feel like maybe I'm not as invisible as I thought." Grace's vision blurred as she continued reading. Entry after entry revealed Jake's growing admiration for her character, his careful observations of her kindness to students and neighbors, his appreciation for her intelligence and independence. But more than that, the journal revealed the depth of his feelings he'd apparently been harboring long before she'd worked up the courage to declare her own. Grace helped organize the Murphy barn raising today, watched her coordinate. Food and supplies like a general planning a campaign, but with such warmth that everyone felt included rather than managed. When she smiled at me during the dinner, felt something shift in my chest. Been trying to convince myself it was just gratitude, but I'm not that good at lying to myself anymore. The entries grew more personal as the weeks progressed, chronicling not just Jake's observations, but his internal struggle with his feelings. Walked her home after church today. Wanted to tell her how much her friendship means to me, but caught myself just in time. Woman like Grace deserves better than a hired hand, with no prospects and too much history. Best thing I can do is keep my distance before I start imagining things that could never be. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she read Jake's account of their walk by the creek, the day she'd given him the bookmark. "She made me a bookmark. Took time and thought and care to create something just for me. Been carrying it everywhere, even when I'm not reading, just to have something she made with her own hands. Know I'm being foolish, but can't help wondering what it would feel like to have someone care about me the way she seems to care about everyone else's happiness." The final entries were the most heart-wrenching, documenting Jake's reaction to her declaration of love and his reasons for pulling away. "She said she loves me. Grace Whitman, the finest woman I've ever known, said she loves me. Part of me wanted to grab her right there and never let go. But what kind of selfish bastard would I be to trap someone like her with someone like me? She thinks she knows what she wants now, but what happens in 5 years when she realizes she could have had better? What happens when she starts resenting the limitations my background puts on her life?" Reverend Holloway arrived today. Watched him talking to Grace after services, saw the respect in her eyes when he quoted Latin poetry. "This is what she deserves. Someone who can match her intelligence, someone who can offer her the kind of life her education and refinement have prepared her for. Hurts like hell. But sometimes loving someone means wanting their happiness more than your own." Grace closed the journal with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the revelation of Jake's true feelings. All this time, while she'd been questioning whether her love was genuine enough to overcome his doubts, he'd been documenting evidence of her care and kindness, treasuring every small interaction while simultaneously convincing himself he wasn't worthy of them. The photograph fell to the floor as she stood, and Grace picked it up with new understanding. Jake hadn't just admired her from afar. He'd cherished even this small image of their shared moment with the children. The fact that he'd hidden it in her personal book suggested he'd found some way to visit the schoolhouse when she wasn't there, perhaps helping with maintenance or repairs, as he'd done so many times. But more than that, placing the photograph in her copy of Whitman felt symbolic. Walt Whitman wrote about the beauty of ordinary people living extraordinary lives through love and connection. Jake had chosen to hide his treasured memory in poetry that celebrated the worth of common humanity, perhaps the very worth he couldn't see in himself. Grace wiped her tears and carefully returned the journal to its hiding place. She couldn't let Jake know she'd discovered his private thoughts, but neither could she pretend this revelation hadn't changed everything. Jake Morrison loved her, had been loving her for months, documenting her kindness and wisdom while simultaneously planning to sacrifice his own happiness for what he perceived as her benefit. His noble intentions were breaking both their hearts, and Grace was suddenly furious at his stubborn martyrdom. As she climbed down from the loft and gathered her repair tools, Grace made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She was tired of polite distance and careful propriety. She was tired of watching Jake torture himself with unworthy self-doubt, while Reverend Holloway pressed his suit with smooth confidence. Jake Morrison thought she deserved better than what he could offer. Well, she was about to show him exactly what she thought she deserved, and it had nothing to do with social position or refined conversation, and everything to do with the contents of that hidden journal. The photograph went into her teaching. Satchel and Grace left the schoolhouse with the first genuine smile she'd worn in weeks. It was time to stop letting Jake's fears dictate the boundaries of their relationship. If he was too stubborn to fight for their happiness, then she would simply have to fight hard enough for both of them. The simple gold ring had belonged to Jake's grandmother, passed down through generations of Morrison women who'd built lives on faith, hard work, and the kind of love that endured through prairie winters and harvest failures. Jake had carried it with him for 3 years now, wrapped in soft cloth and hidden in the deepest corner of his saddlebags, not because he'd been looking for someone to give it to, but because it was the only tangible connection he had left to family. Now, as he sat alone in the bunkhouse at the Mackenzie Ranch on a cold January evening, Jake held the ring up to the lamplight and wondered if he'd finally found the woman worthy of wearing it. The weeks since discovering Grace's burned letters had changed something fundamental in their relationship. She'd stopped accepting Reverend Holloway's invitations to social gatherings with polite but firm excuses. She'd begun addressing Jake by his first name in public, ignoring the raised eyebrows this caused among the more conventional townspeople. Most significantly, she'd resumed their Sunday evening Bible discussions with a pointed intimacy that made it clear she was no longer willing to pretend they were merely intellectual companions. "Jake," she'd said during their most recent conversation, "I've been thinking about the parable of the talents, about the servant who buried his gift instead of using it because he was afraid of losing what little he had." Jake had understood the implication immediately, but he'd been too overwhelmed by her directness to respond adequately. Grace was making it clear that she considered their relationship, their potential for happiness together, a gift that shouldn't be wasted out of fear. Now, 3 days later, he was still wrestling with the question she'd posed without words. Was his fear of losing Grace actually preventing him from ever truly having her? The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his contemplation. Through the bunkhouse window, Jake could see a familiar buggy pulling into the ranch yard, one that made his stomach clench with anxiety. Grace's sister, Eleanor, had arrived from Denver unannounced, and even from a distance, Jake could see the disapproval radiating from her rigid posture as she surveyed the rustic surroundings. Eleanor Hartwell was everything Grace was not: conventional, status-conscious, and firmly convinced that her younger sister was wasting her life in a frontier backwater. She'd visited once before, shortly after Grace's arrival in Sagebrush Bend, and had spent the entire week cataloguing everything she found lacking in the town's amenities and social opportunities. Jake watched from his window as Grace emerged from the schoolhouse to greet her sister, noting the way Grace's shoulders tensed with defensive anticipation. He'd heard enough about Eleanor from Grace's careful comments to understand that this visit was likely to involve considerable pressure for Grace to return to civilized society. What Jake hadn't expected was to find himself included in Eleanor's campaign. The confrontation came the following afternoon, when Jake was repairing fence posts near the main road. Eleanor approached him with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to getting their way through sheer force of personality. "Mr. Morrison," she announced without preamble, "I believe we need to have a conversation." Jake straightened slowly, his experience with hostile encounters making him carefully neutral in his response. "Ma'am, I understand you've been friendly with my sister during your time here." The way Eleanor pronounced friendly made it sound like something vaguely scandalous. Jake kept his expression impassive. "Miss Grace has been kind to me." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor studied him with the calculating look of someone appraising livestock. "You're a handsome man, Mr. Morrison, I'll grant you that. And I'm sure Grace finds your rustic qualities appealing in a temporary sort of way, but surely you understand that a woman of her breeding and education deserves better than what a ranch hand can provide." Jake felt the familiar sting of shame that always accompanied such observations, but something new rose alongside it, a flash of anger at hearing Grace's feelings dismissed as temporary infatuation. "Your sister is a grown woman capable of making her own decisions," he said quietly. "My sister," Eleanor replied sharply, "is a romantic who's always been drawn to lost causes and wounded creatures. She sees potential for improvement in everything from stray cats to hopeless students. The question is whether you're selfish enough to take advantage of her charitable nature." The words hit their intended target with devastating accuracy. Jake had to acknowledge the kernel of truth in Eleanor's assessment. Grace was indeed drawn to helping others, to seeing potential where others saw only problems. Was it possible that her feelings for him were more about her generous nature than genuine love? "What exactly are you asking me to do, Mrs. Hartwell?" Eleanor's smile was sharp with triumph. "I'm asking you to consider Grace's best interests instead of your own desires. There are opportunities waiting for her in Denver, teaching positions at established schools, social connections that could lead to a proper marriage with someone of her own class. But she won't consider them as long as she's distracted by whatever she thinks she feels for you." Jake absorbed this information with growing dread. He'd known intellectually that Grace could have a different life if she chose to leave Sagebrush Bend, but hearing it laid out so explicitly, the concrete alternatives to the limited future he could offer, made his own inadequacy impossible to ignore. "She seems happy here," he said, though the words felt weak even to him. "Grace makes the best of any situation," Eleanor replied dismissively. "It's one of her more admirable qualities, but also one of her most limiting ones. She settles for contentment when she could have genuine fulfillment." That evening, Jake found himself in the uncomfortable position of overhearing a conversation between the sisters as he delivered firewood to Grace's house. Their voices carried through the thin walls, and despite his better judgment, he found himself frozen in place as Eleanor pressed her campaign. "Grace, be reasonable," Eleanor was saying. "What kind of future can you possibly have with a man like that? You'd be trapped in this dusty nowhere of a town, raising children who'd have no advantages, no opportunities for advancement. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," Grace replied with controlled patience, "is to make my own decisions about my life without interference from people who don't understand what makes me happy." "And what does make you happy? Teaching farmers' children basic arithmetic, living in a house barely larger than our servants' quarters back home, pinching pennies and making do with second-hand everything?" Jake heard the creak of floorboards as one of the women moved across the room. "Eleanor," Grace said with quiet firmness, "I've lived in grand houses with servants and fine furnishings. I was engaged to a man who could provide everything you think I should want, and I was profoundly unhappy. If you can't understand the difference between having impressive things and building a meaningful life, then we have nothing more to discuss." "Don't be naive, Grace. Love doesn't pay bills or provide security in old age. What happens when the romance fades and you're left with nothing but hardship and regret?" There was a long pause before Grace answered, and Jake found himself holding his breath. "Then at least I'll have lived according to my own values instead of someone else's expectations," Grace said finally. "I'd rather have 1 year of genuine happiness than a lifetime of comfortable misery." Jake heard footsteps approaching the door and quickly resumed stacking firewood, but Eleanor's earlier words echoed in his mind as he worked. Trapped in a dusty nowhere of a town, no advantages for their children. The weight of those limitations felt crushing when laid out so starkly. Back in the bunkhouse that night, Jake stared at his grandmother's ring and tried to imagine the conversation where he would ask Grace to accept those limitations willingly. Could he really ask her to give up opportunities for advancement, social connections, cultural advantages, all for the sake of his love? The more he thought about it, the more Eleanor's words gained power over his imagination. Grace had defended their relationship tonight, but what about 5 years from now? 10 years? 20? When the initial passion faded and she was left facing the daily reality of a life constrained by his humble circumstances. Jake thought about the journal he'd been keeping, filled with observations about Grace's kindness and intelligence. But kindness could be extended to anyone, and intelligence deserved opportunities he couldn't provide. What if Eleanor was right about Grace's generous nature, leading her to settle for less than she deserved? The ring seemed to mock him as he held it up to the lamplight. His grandmother had worn it proudly, but she'd married a man who owned land, who could provide for a family, who had something to offer beyond strong hands and a willing heart. What did Jake have to offer someone like Grace, except limitations disguised as love? By morning, Jake had made his decision. He would leave Sagebrush Bend before he could do any more damage to Grace's future prospects. It would probably hurt for the rest of his life, but loving someone meant wanting their happiness more than your own satisfaction. He gave his notice to Pete that afternoon, claiming he'd received word of opportunities further north. Pete's weathered face showed surprise and what might have been disappointment, but he didn't pry into Jake's reasons. "You've been a good hand, Jake," Pete said quietly. "If you change your mind about leaving, there'll always be work here for you." Jake nodded his thanks, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to explain that changing his mind would be the most selfish thing he could do. The ring went back into its cloth wrapping, back into the deepest corner of his saddlebags, where it belonged. Some dreams, Jake reflected bitterly, were too costly for the people you loved most. He would finish out the week, complete his obligations to Pete, and be gone before Grace could waste any more of her precious life on someone who could never give her what she truly deserved. It was, Jake told himself, the most loving thing he could do for her, even if it felt like voluntarily tearing his own heart from his chest and leaving it behind in the Colorado dust. Grace discovered Jake's plan to leave in the most mundane way possible, through Tommy Mackenzie's innocent chatter as she dismissed her students for the day. "Miss Grace, Grandpa Pete says Mr. Jake is going away," Tommy announced with 8-year-old directness. "Says he's finished his work here and needs to move on to other places. Are you sad about that?" Grace felt the world shift beneath her feet, but she managed to maintain her composure long enough to send Tommy home with reassuring words about how sometimes grown-ups needed to make difficult choices. Only when the schoolhouse was empty did she allow herself to fully absorb the implications of what she'd learned. Jake was leaving. After everything, After their growing closeness, after the journal entries she'd discovered, after the way he'd looked at her during their recent conversations, he was simply going to disappear from her life without even saying goodbye. The realization struck her with stunning clarity. Eleanor had won. Whatever poisonous words Grace's sister had whispered in Jake's ear had succeeded in convincing him that loving Grace meant leaving her. Grace locked the schoolhouse door with hands that trembled only slightly and walked home through the early evening light with a sense of purpose that surprised her with its intensity. She found Eleanor in the parlor, packing her belongings in preparation for her return to Denver the following morning. "You spoke to Jake," Grace said without preamble. Eleanor looked up from her trunk with an expression of mild satisfaction. "I had a conversation with Mr. Morrison, yes. I felt it was important to help him understand certain realities about your situation." "What realities would those be?" "That a man who truly cares for your welfare would want better for you than a life of genteel poverty in the middle of nowhere." Eleanor folded a silk scarf with careful precision. "He's not unintelligent, Grace. Once I explained the opportunities you'd be giving up by staying here, he reached the obvious conclusion." Grace felt anger rise in her chest, not just at Eleanor's interference, but at Jake's willingness to be manipulated by someone who didn't know either of them well enough to judge what would make them happy. "Did it occur to you," Grace said quietly, "that I might be capable of deciding for myself what opportunities I want to pursue? Grace, darling, you've always been too generous for your own good. You see potential in everyone and everything, but that doesn't mean you should sacrifice your own prospects for the sake of charitable impulses." The casual dismissal of her feelings as charitable impulses was the final straw. Grace had spent 5 years building a life based on her own choices, her own values, her own understanding of what constituted a meaningful existence. She would not allow Eleanor, or Jake for that matter, to reduce that life to a series of poor decisions made from misguided kindness. "Eleanor," Grace said with deadly calm, "I want you to pack your things and leave. Tonight, take the evening stage back to Denver and don't come back." Eleanor's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Grace, there's no need for dramatics. I was leaving tomorrow anyway." "Tonight," Grace repeated. "And when you get back to Denver, you can tell anyone who asks that your sister is exactly where she wants to be, doing exactly what she chooses to do, with exactly the person she chooses to love." Without waiting for Eleanor's response, Grace left the house and walked through the darkening streets toward the Mackenzie Ranch. If Jake thought he could make decisions about her life based on other people's opinions of what she deserved, then he was about to learn otherwise. She found him in the barn, loading his saddlebags by lamplight with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. He looked up as she entered, and she saw surprise, guilt, and something that might have been relief flicker across his features. "Grace," he said quietly, "I was going to come say goodbye before I left." "Were you?" Grace moved closer, noting how he seemed to shrink back despite his superior size. "How thoughtful. A brief farewell before you disappeared from my life forever, based on a conversation with someone who doesn't know me well enough to choose my breakfast, much less my future." Jake's jaw tightened. "Eleanor cares about your welfare. Eleanor cares about her own vision of respectability." Grace stepped close enough to see the pain Jake was trying to hide. "But that's not really why you're leaving, is it, Jake? You're leaving because it's easier to run away than to trust that someone might actually love you enough to choose you over easier alternatives." "Grace, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Grace reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the folded wedding dress pattern she'd been carrying for weeks, her mother's pattern, carefully preserved and carried west as a symbol of hope for her own future. "I understand that you think I'm too fragile or too foolish to know my own heart. I understand that you'd rather break both our hearts than risk the possibility that I might actually mean what I say when I tell you I love you." She held out the Patton, watching Jake's eyes widen as he recognized what she was offering. "This was my mother's wedding dress pattern, Jake. I've been carrying it for 5 years, waiting for someone brave enough to deserve it. I thought that someone was you." Jake stared at the pattern as if it might burn him. "Grace, I can't give you the life you deserve. What if the life you can give me is exactly the life I want?" Grace asked softly. "What if your love, your partnership, your presence in my daily existence is worth more to me than all the social advantages Eleanor thinks I'm missing?" For a moment, Jake's resolve seemed to waver. Grace saw longing war with fear in his expression, saw him almost reach for the pattern she offered. Then his face closed again, and he turned back to his packing. "You'll thank me for this someday," he said roughly, "when you're married to someone who can give you everything I can't." Grace stood holding her mother's wedding pattern, watching the man she loved choose fear over faith, martyrdom over happiness. "No, Jake," she said quietly. "I won't thank you. I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what we might have built together if you'd been brave enough to believe that love was worth the risk." Jake left before dawn, as cowards and broken-hearted men often do, thinking he could escape the weight of his decision by putting distance between himself and the choice he'd made. He rode north toward the mountain passes, his saddlebags packed, and his grandmother's ring still wrapped in cloth, carried along like a talisman of the future he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. He made it exactly 12 miles before old Pete Mackenzie caught up with him. Pete's horse was lathered with sweat from hard riding, and the old rancher's expression showed the kind of focused anger that Jake had never seen directed at him before. Without preamble, Pete dismounted and walked straight up to Jake with the purposeful stride of a man who'd run out of patience. "Boy," Pete said quietly, "I've got something to say to you, and you're going to listen whether you want to or not." Jake remained mounted, partly from stubborn pride and partly because he suspected that facing Pete on equal ground might require more courage than he currently possessed. "Pete, I appreciate everything you've done for me, but—" "Shut up," Pete interrupted with startling vehemence. "Just shut up and listen for once in your damn fool life." The profanity from the normally gentle rancher was shocking enough to accomplish what politeness hadn't. Jake's mouth closed and he listened. I buried my Martha 15 years ago," Pete began, his voice rough with memory. "Finest woman who ever drew breath, and smart enough to see through my bull-headed nonsense when I was too proud to ask for help or too scared to believe I was worthy of her love." Pete's weathered hands gripped his horse's reins with white-knuckled intensity. "You know what I regret most about those years before I married her? All the time I wasted being afraid. All the months I spent trying to talk her out of caring about me because I thought she deserved someone better." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as Pete's words hit uncomfortably close to home. "That's different, Pete. Martha was a schoolteacher from back east who could have had her pick of men with better prospects than a struggling rancher," Pete continued relentlessly. "Sound familiar? But you know what Martha told me when I finally worked up the courage to ask why she'd chosen me over all those other possibilities?" Jake waited, dreading the answer. "She said love isn't about deserving, boy. It's about choosing. And she'd chosen me not because I was the best option available, but because I was the man who made her happiest, the man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw." Pete stepped closer to Jake's horse, close enough that Jake could see the tears threatening in the older man's eyes. "Grace Whitman has been crying for 3 hours straight. Not the pretty kind of crying that ladies do when they want sympathy, but the deep, body-shaking kind that comes from having your heart ripped clean out of your chest. You did that to her, Jake. You took the finest, bravest woman in this territory and broke her spirit because you were too cowardly to believe she knew her own mind." The words hit Jake like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the noble self-sacrifice he'd wrapped around his decision to leave. "I was trying to protect her," Jake said weakly. "Protect her from what? From being loved by someone who'd lay down his life for her happiness? from building a life with a man who respects her intelligence and values her opinions, from having children with someone who teach them to be gentle with anything smaller or weaker than themselves. Pete's voice grew stronger with each question. Or were you trying to protect yourself from the possibility that someone might actually love you enough to choose you over easier alternatives? Jake flinched as Pete's accusation hit the truth he'd been avoiding. What if she changes her mind? Jake asked quietly. What if 5 years from now she realizes she could have had more? Pete's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. Then you'll have had 5 years of happiness instead of a lifetime of regret. But more than that, boy, you'll have trusted her enough to let her make her own choices about what kind of life she wants to build. Jake looked back toward Sagebrush Bend, invisible now behind the rolling hills, but still pulling at his heart with invisible threads. She showed me her mother's wedding dress pattern, he said finally. I know, Mrs. Henderson told me. Pete's voice carried a note of hope. That pattern's been sitting in Grace's hope chest for 5 years, waiting for someone worth sharing it with. Jake thought about the ring in his saddlebags, about the journal entries where he documented every kindness Grace had shown him, about the way her eyes lit up when she talked about books or teaching or the simple pleasure of a shared conversation. Pete, he said slowly, what if I'm wrong about everything? What if the life I can offer her is exactly what she wants? Then you'd better get back there and find out, Pete replied, because that woman deserves to be fought for, and you're the only man fool enough to think you're not worth fighting for. Jake turned his horse around without another word, his heart pounding with the terrifying possibility that he might actually deserve the happiness Grace was offering. The ride back to Sagebrush Bend was the longest 12 miles of his life. 6 months after their wedding, Grace Morrison stood in the doorway of the expanded schoolhouse, watching her husband teach her students the finer points of horse care. The June morning was warm and bright, filled with the kind of golden light that made everything seem possible. Jake had insisted on building additional classroom space as his wedding gift to her, not because the old schoolhouse wasn't adequate, but because he understood that her work was sacred to her and deserved a setting that honored its importance. The new addition included a proper library corner, better windows for reading, and a small office where Grace could prepare lessons and meet with parents. Mrs. Grace, Tommy Mackenzie called out, now 9 years old and still bursting with curiosity. Mr. Jake says horses can tell if you're afraid just by how you smell. Is that really true? Grace smiled at the question. Tommy had appointed himself official intermediary between his teacher and the man who'd become like a favorite uncle to all her students. Mr. Jake is quite right, Grace replied, moving closer to the group gathered around the gentle mare Jake was using for his demonstration. Animals are much better than people at reading what we might call emotional honesty. Jake looked up at her words, and Grace caught the private smile he reserved just for her, the one that still made her pulse quicken after months of marriage. Their courtship, once Jake had finally returned from his aborted flight, had been swift and certain. There'd been no more wavering, no more self-doubt, no more noble attempts at self-sacrifice. Jake had appeared at her door that evening, covered in trail dust and carrying his grandmother's ring, his proposal as direct and honest as everything else about him. Grace Whitman, he'd said, dropping to one knee right there on her front porch, where anyone might see. I've been a fool and a coward, but I'm done being both. I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life, and if you'll have me, I'd be honored to spend the rest of my days proving that I'm worthy of the gift you're offering. Grace had said yes before he'd finished speaking, and they'd been married a month later in a ceremony that brought the entire community together. Even Eleanor had attended, though she'd spent the reception making pointed observations about frontier wedding customs to anyone who would listen. Now, watching Jake patiently answer her students' endless questions about animal behavior, Grace felt a familiar surge of gratitude for the decision they'd both made to choose love over fear. Mrs. Morrison, Mary Patterson called out. She was 17. Now, and preparing to leave for teacher training in Denver, could you help me with something? Grace joined Mary near the schoolhouse steps, where the young woman was working on a piece of embroidery with unusual concentration. It's for David Chen, Mary explained quietly. He's asked permission to court me properly, and I wanted to make something special for him, but I'm not sure about the pattern. Grace examined the delicate work, a bookmark similar to the one she'd made for Jake years earlier, but decorated with Chinese characters that David had taught Mary to write. It's beautiful work, Mary. The characters are perfectly formed. David taught me to write courage and trust, Mary said, blushing slightly. He says those are the most important things in any relationship. Grace felt a familiar tightness in her throat at the young woman's words. David Chen had grown into a thoughtful, intelligent young man whose family had become pillars of the Sagebrush Bend community. His courtship of Mary was conducted with the kind of respect and patience that suggested he'd learned important lessons from observing the adults in his life. I think those are wise choices, Grace told Mary, and I think David is very fortunate to have captured the attention of someone who understands the value of both. The morning lesson concluded with Jake demonstrating proper grooming techniques while Grace supervised from nearby, occasionally adding observations about the connection between caring for animals and caring for people in general. It was a partnership that had evolved naturally, Jake's practical knowledge complementing Grace's educational philosophy, creating learning experiences that neither could have provided alone. As her students dispersed for lunch, Grace found herself alone with Jake for one of the rare quiet moments their busy days allowed. "Any regrets yet?" Jake asked, settling beside her on the schoolhouse steps with the easy familiarity of a man who'd found his place in the world. "Only that we wasted so much time being afraid of what we wanted," Grace replied, leaning against his solid shoulder. Jake was quiet for a moment, and Grace could sense him working through thoughts he wasn't quite ready to voice. "What is it?" she asked gently. "Grace," he said slowly, "how would you feel about having our own students to teach? The kind that would call you Mama instead of Mrs. Morrison." Grace felt her breath catch at the carefully phrased question. They'd talked abstractly about children, but Jake had seemed hesitant to assume she'd want to add motherhood to her already. "A full life. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd consider letting me give you a few more reasons to smile the way you smiled at Mary just now when she was talking about her future." Grace turned to study Jake's face, seeing hope and vulnerability in equal measure. The man who'd once been afraid to believe anyone could love him was now brave enough to imagine building a family with her. "Jake Morrison," she said softly, "I would consider myself the luckiest woman in Colorado Territory to raise children with you." The kiss they shared was witnessed only by the afternoon breeze and a pair of hawks circling overhead, but it carried the weight of promises kept and dreams finally allowed to flourish. As they separated and prepared to return to their respective afternoon duties, Grace caught sight of the family portrait hanging in her expanded classroom, a formal photograph taken on their wedding day, showing her and Jake surrounded by their students and the community that had watched their love story unfold. In the photograph, Jake's hand rested on Grace's shoulder with protective tenderness, while her hand covered his with quiet certainty. They looked like what they'd become. Two people who'd learned that the best kind of love was built on respect, trust, and the courage to believe that some gifts were too precious to refuse. The afternoon bell rang, calling Grace back to her teaching duties, but she carried with her the warm knowledge that at day's end she'd return to a home where she was valued not for what she could provide or how she reflected on someone else's reputation, but simply for being exactly who she was. It was, Grace reflected as her students filed back into the classroom, a very good life indeed.